Hello. So this video is going to be a performance review of Sweeney Todd, the Demon Barber of Fleet Street, performed by Penn State Theatre. So, and directed by Zach Steele. I'll mention that at the outset. So, I'm going to start by mentioning that I'm not a musicals person. It is not really my genre of choice, but I very much like Sweeney Todd. I think it's a very interesting storyline. I think the character is interesting, the themes are interesting, etc., etc. I will also mention that the performance that I saw had technical problems. There was a brief interval in which they actually had to stop the show, I believe because of a power failure in some of the lighting. And you know what? So I actually have critiques of the lighting in this production, and I'll go ahead and just get those out of the way and then talk about the more positive things. Maybe it had to do with where I was sitting, because I was very far to house left and fairly close to the stage. So I had a rather angled view of the production. But I feel like a lot of the choral performers or ensemble performers, since I think the proper term in musicals is ensemble rather than chorus, because French is classier than Greek, I suppose. But especially in the ensemble, a lot of people seemed to me like they were standing just outside the spotlight that was meant to be illuminating them. And I don't know whether that was a specific choice. On the one hand, I kind of think it was, because it just kept happening. On the other hand, I don't understand it as a creative choice. Like, if you put a spotlight here and the person is standing here to sing, why are you doing that? I don't understand that. So it was one of two things. It was either a creative choice that I don't understand, or the spotlight was here, the person was supposed to be standing here in the spotlight, but they were off their mark. And that was just happening consistently with a lot of performers. Which it seems unlikely to me, because usually Penn State Theatre is extremely good. So to have that consistently occurring, I don't know what to make of it. That being said, we know that they were having problems with the lighting, so it is possible that the lighting was also off, that every actor was on their proper mark, and the lights were just shifted to one side consistently. The other critique I have of the lighting, this is a very small thing, it doesn't really matter for the performance, but it bothered me. There were times when the spotlight would bounce. So particularly on Joanna, played by Ririki Kuroki, I had a pretty good view of her, because I was sitting, again, house left, fairly near the front, third row up, basically. Most of her performance, it's about 85% of her performance, was almost immediately in front of me. And she often had a spotlight on her, because she tended to have either solos or duets. The spotlight bounced a lot. Now, that's not, again, an important thing that for most people will make any difference. I'm sure most people in the audience probably didn't notice. I ran spot for a show in high school, and I was told, do not let the spotlight bounce. Your job as the spotlight operator is to keep that spot steady, so that what we are looking at is the performer in the light and not the light itself. I was looking at the light. Yeah. So there are those technical aspects that I didn't think were fantastic. My other critique is a general critique I have of musicals, and I think this is the Philistine in me who doesn't understand or appreciate musicals properly. I have the same sense about opera. There was a lot of the lyrics I just couldn't understand. I don't think it mattered that much because, again, this is the uncultured side of me talking. I think with musicals and opera, if you get the emotional gist and you follow the general storyline, you're good. I don't know that most of the lyrics need to necessarily be understood, but especially the ensemble parts and the parts where you had, say, one pair of people, say Joanna and Anthony over here, and then you had Judge Turpin and Beetle Bamford up in the audience singing, and they were each singing their own conversations, basically. I had a lot of trouble hearing the lyrics of either of them. Again, I don't know that that matters. So that critique's out of the way. It was a very good production. Stylistically, visually, it was really, really interesting. There's very much a good sort of gothic, steampunky, ominous texture to the costuming, to the physical movements of the characters around stage. Ethan Peterson, who played Sweeney Todd, was really, really good at being sort of menacing and surly and sulking. Madeline Glave, who played Mrs. Lovett, was really amazing at being this sort of comic relief, and this sort of weird in-between figure of, to a certain extent, trying to restrain Todd's murderous impulses, but also coming up with the idea of baking the flesh of his victims into pies in order to make money. Judge Turpin, played by, let me follow the line along here, Gavin Ditz, really, really good. He had this great sort of menacing, the sort of menacing presence you get with someone who has a tremendous amount of wealth and power within society and who can do what they want. Someone who is very hypocritical, and yet someone whose social status largely insulates them from consequences. So he was very, very good in that role. Everybody was really good in their performances. And I will say, despite not being a person who particularly appreciates singing, musicals, opera, things like that, there were some absolutely fucking spectacular singers. Madeline Glave, I thought was really, really, really good. But for me, I think the best singer, the person whose voice I loved the most in this show, was Ronnie Spotto, who played Anthony. I think he was just absolutely amazing as a singer. For reasons I can't explain, because I don't have a vocabulary to talk about music in that way. But there was a clarity and a power to his voice that I found really, really, really impressive. Yeah, it was a really good production overall. But I do want to talk about Sweeney Todd, the Demon Barber of Fleet Street, just sort of as a story, because I'm interested in the story. First off, Todd is not a demon, nor is he a barber for demons, which would have also been quite a cool element. He is a prolific and very efficient serial killer. The Sweeney Todd story, as far as I know, comes out of 19th century penny dreadfuls, which were these very cheap, sensationalist pieces of fiction that were just beloved of London. They dealt with the supernatural, with horror, the gothic, serial killers, anything salacious, anything titillating, anything that people wanted to read about. They were the true crime podcasts of their day, in a way, except they were fiction. But Sweeney Todd, so he had been married to this woman. They had a child together, a daughter. And then the Judge Turpin, takes an interest in Lucy, the wife, and he uses his position to have Todd transported to Botany Bay. In the early 1800s, being sent to Botany Bay or Van Diemen's Land in what's now Australia and Tasmania, respectively, that was a pretty horrific sentence. Todd manages to escape. He comes back to London, sets himself up as a master barber, which of course he is, and he begins he begins a quest for revenge against Beadle Bamford and Judge Turpin, the two people who he blames for falsely transporting him and the death of his wife, ostensibly. Put a pin in that for the moment. Todd takes up with Mrs. Lovett. He sets up shop above her meat pie store. The meat pies are terrible because she can't afford meat. And so Todd sort of realizes he can rid London society of a number of hypocrites, a number of people who use and abuse their power to penalize the poor. And so he begins a serial killing spree, essentially. And Mrs. Lovett cooks the flesh of these victims. They develop an elaborate system where he rigs his barber's chair to drop bodies through a trap door down into the bakery room, etc., etc. And they're very successful. He kills a lot of people. She becomes very, very wealthy selling these pies. People are like, this is the fucking best meat pie I've ever eaten in my life. I'm going to eat more. And then eventually, Todd manages to get his revenge. He kills the Beadle. He kills the Judge. There's a whole separate storyline where Anthony, this young, very sort of heroic, idealized sailor who had rescued Todd from a shipwreck, Anthony falls in love with Joanna, who is Todd's daughter, who's now an adult-ish. She's going to be like 16 or something like that. I think she was like a baby when he was transported, and it's been about 15 years, something like that. So that's she's youngish. I mean, not young. She's, by today's standards, she is creepily young for everybody. Well, for Anthony and Judge Turpin to be wanting to smooch her. By the early 19th century standards, she was of a fine age to marry. It was a different time. Whatever. It was, yeah, you know. Anyway, so Anthony is in love with Joanna. She is in love with him. They're basically on a, like, we've seen each other, but she has been raised by Judge Turpin, and she's very, very, basically just, like, trapped in her house. She's essentially a prisoner in the house with Judge Turpin, who is her guardian now. She's his ward. And they basically he sees her from the street. She sees him through the window, and they fall in love at first sight. And he has this recurring song, which actually is really problematic and creepy, that he's going to steal her. That's what we call kidnapping in the business. That's not ideal. Rescue might be a better way of putting it, and that's probably more accurate given what we know about how Judge Turpin treats her. But the lyrics is, "I'll steal you, Joanna." And that isn't good. Don't steal people. Don't do that. That is bad. Hashtag woke, if you insist. But yeah, so Anthony is trying to get Joanna. Joanna is trying to not be forced to marry Judge Turpin, who she kind of thinks of as her dad. Understandably on her part, not wanting to marry him. He's also a terrible dude, etc., etc. So all of this stuff is going on. There's various sort of swirling plot elements, etc. And then finally, it seems like people are starting to maybe suspect that there's some serial killing going on. But Todd manages to kill the beetle, kill the judge, and he ends up killing this old beggar woman who has shown up throughout the play and generally been regarded by everyone as a nuisance, except by Anthony, who consistently gives her money. As a sailor, not real clear where he gets that much money, but it doesn't matter for the plot. She comes into Todd's shop trying to find the beetle, trying to sort of figure out what's going on, and Todd ends up murdering her. Only to subsequently realize, after her body has been dumped into the bakery and he goes down after it, only to subsequently realize that that is in fact his wife. Mrs. Lovett said that she had poisoned herself. She doesn't technically say that Lucy had died, but she implies it so that she can start a relationship with Todd. Todd is not thrilled with this, so he ends up murdering Mrs. Lovett, etc., etc. Now, the reason that I make this point is I think it raises an interesting question of whether or not Sweeney Todd is a tragedy. I kind of think it is. Because if you think about the typical trajectory of a tragedy, right? You start with someone who is usually reasonably privileged, traditionally. A tragic hero tends to start out with a certain degree of privilege. King Oedipus, Prince Hamlet, whatever it is. That isn't necessarily the case in modern tragedies. Because you start out with somebody at a certain level. Things get better for them. And then things dramatically crash. Typically because of their own actions, their own hubris in the Greek terminology. Sweeney Todd gives into his morbid nature, and he feels that he can kill everybody who deserves to be killed. He pursues revenge regardless of the costs, and it ends up costing him the person that he had been taking revenge for. He, in fact, ends up killing the woman that he was ostensibly avenging. So there is a tragic element to this. The other question that I think is interesting to think about with Sweeney Todd is he an Übermensch? So Friedrich Nietzsche, the nihilist philosopher, 19th century nihilist philosopher, came up with this idea of the Übermensch, someone who the typical moral rules and guidelines of society does not apply to. They are someone who is not bound by ethical conventions in the pursuit of their own will. Now, for Nietzsche, the Übermensch embodied the life instinct. Todd seems to embody a death instinct, an instinct to kill. But I don't know that those are necessarily as mutually exclusive as they might sound. I mean, Todd has a distinctive moral compass, right? He believes that those he is killing have committed wrongs and deserve to die. And so in that sense, there is a twisted affirmation of life. It's a moral compass premised on the idea that life should be fair. It should be just. That people should have the opportunity to live well. And that those who stand in the way of that, corrupt judges, violent law enforcement officials, the wealthy who exploit the labor of the poor and working classes, etc., that they deserve to die because they have made life wretched for the vast majority of people in society. So there's an element of sort of Übermenschness to this character that I think is interesting. And of course, this is potentially, this last portion, the sort of Marxist element of those who use their social position against the interests of the poor deserve to die. This of course has a sort of Marxist element to it. And I think this is, interestingly enough, what maybe distinguishes Sweeney Todd from another penny dreadful character like Spring-Heeled Jack, but also from real life serial killers like Jack the Ripper, right? Because Jack targeted working class women. They're conventionally regarded as sex workers, though there are some historians who are now contesting that. But at the very least, they were working class women or poor women. Todd attacks the gentry. He attacks people with wealth and privilege and money. Wealth and money is the two different things. Wealth, privilege, and power. This is a very different type of figure than someone like Jack the Ripper, in that Sweeney Todd is someone that the poor can look up to as a protector against the violence inherent in the system under which they live. Right? This is a society of deep social inequality, of substantial and continuous exploitation by factory owners, by the law, by the military, etc., etc. And Todd strikes back against that in a way that can be seen as admirable, even though he is a prolific and efficient serial killer.